I am showing how to restore an old family heirloom knife. Considering its age, the rust is mostly on the surface, but there are spots that present pitting corrosion. There is also a fine hairline crack in the stone handle that will not be addressed. There may even be a story behind how it got there in the first place. This is not my personal knife, so I want to be very conservative on how far I take this project. The stone handle covers what appears to be a brass tang and bolster, which will also need to be polished. I begin with a product called evapo-rust. This product removes majority of the rust as a soaking solution. This is an amazing rust remover and is safe to use without gloves. Using a quart jar, I poured just enough to submerge the blade. In order to keep the knife upright in the solution, first a plastic bag was secured to the mouth of the jar with a jar ring. Then the knife was simply plunged through the plastic straight down into the evapo-rust. The instructions give a timetable of 30 minutes to several hours depending on the amount of rust. Also, there is no maximum amount of time that would cause issues or damage. In this case, I left the knife in the solution for a couple hours. After 2 hours, the majority of the rust seems to disappear. The blade was rinsed in water and wiped dry. Next, I fastened a wire wheel brush on my drill press. I took my time wire brushing both sides and the spine of the blade. It was important to position the knife so it wouldn't be grabbed and flung by the wheel. Always work away from the rotation instead of against it. After several minutes, the blade presented a finish of micro web-like scratches. However, the rust was starting to disappear. The only rough spots were found towards the heel of the blade, where the rust sat too deep in the pitted metal. I spent extra time brushing those areas, but I found the only way to really address this is to work those areas down to a smoother surface. I had to use a file for this task. I do know that a grinding wheel would have worked better, but I had more control and this took less metal at a slower rate with a file. Since this is a family heirloom, I was being very conservative on how far I was going to take this surface down. I soon decided that the enemy of good is better, so I left some of the rough areas for character. Next, I switched out the wire wheel brush for a 1/4-inch shank backing pad. This is part of a 3-inch sanding and buffing disc kit that I purchased online. This kit also includes coarse to fine grit sanding discs as well as buffing discs. Due to the deep mars that the file left, I started off with a coarse 80 grit sanding disc. Before sanding, I put a very light shine of all-purpose oil on the blade between disc changes as I went along. There are other oil products out there, but this is what I had on hand. I've even used WD-40 and found it to work just as well. Starting with the coarse 80 grit sanding disc, I made sure to spend extra time on the rougher areas where the pitting corrosion was present. However, it was important to eventually make whole-length passes until I saw a uniform finish. I paused every so often to inspect the surface and continued on as needed. I found that even after the initial sanding, there was some improvement. I then switched to a 100 grit disc and followed that up with a 320 grit. The amount of time spent sanding is the key to the best finish. It all depends on what you want at the end. In other words, should an antique look brand new, or should there be left some flaws? That, of course, is personal preference. I continued on, switching to finer grit discs. The rest of the progression in grit sizes are as follows: 600 grit, 1000 grit, 1200 grit, 2500 grit, 4000 grit, 7000 grit, And finally, 10,000 grit. Next, I coated the blade with Brasso metal polish. I simply followed the instructions on the container. This product is definitely one of my favorites and has been around for a long time. Then I work the blade with a soft foam buffer pad. Next, I used Brasso to polish the tang and bolster. Starting with an old rag, I worked the brass with the polish. Several coats were repeated. I found, however, that my Dremel tool with a buffering bit did a better job. I continued the rest of the polishing using this technique until I was satisfied with the result. This could be taken even further with more advanced buffing wheels and worked longer for a more perfect finish. But as I said earlier, due to its age and character, I feel like this was a good stopping point. In fact, I am very pleased with the end product.